Your Excellency and Linde, great to have you with us. Thank you so much. I'm going to start by just getting a sense of what you're thinking right now, where you're at in terms of when I say risks to you and mitigating risks, whether that is even doable in this very uncertain environment.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to say that it's one of the risks that we have lived through is the COVID, and that shows the health risk. And the fact that we are here all together is something that showed that we came out of handling this risk, but very, very differently.
Yeah.
And that is something that we need to discuss and learn a lot of lessons from. I also think that this panel is very timely because now we have certainly a lot of risks, and I would like to talk mainly on the risk to the whole international system. But maybe you want to have a short
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So if you could just give me a sense of, you want to talk about the major risk, but how are you feeling right now? It's almost like we've just come out of a pandemic. We've got new risks. Are you concerned about the future?
I think that we need to learn to live with risk after risk after risk.
Yeah.
I mean, there is so many new risks.
So that's the new normal, dealing with risk after risk after risk. We were thinking the new normal would be mask wearing only, but the new normal seems to be very different. Your Excellency, Marcelo, great to have you with us. I think emerging markets are going to be absolutely hit by high inflation, by higher oil prices, and the perceptions of risk have really been flipped on their heads. Tell me about where you're at right now and what Mexico has got top of mind.
I should say that we have 3 years, exceptional 3 years. It's true that we have risk after risk, but in the past 2 or 3 years, we are in the maybe a limit risk survival for humanity. So we display a very complex strategy, but my issue here is about what they have in common, the pandemic and the economic and the new geopolitical risk. Where is the common point? The weakness of the global governance. We are advancing, well, for instance, in pandemic, the main concern for Mexico is to get vaccines on time. So you have very different strategies, but you have nationalistic options or positions or policies. So the countries have access to vaccine in a different speed, which costs thousands of lives. Now, in the geopolitical risk that we are facing right now, it's the same. You have the weakness of the global governance. So which are the limits of the risk that we're confronting? It depends on if we strengthen or not the global governance, I think. This is the main issue right now.
Thank you so much. Welcome, sir. Welcome, Bob. Great to have you on. If there's any organization that focuses on risk, economic growth, and looks at probabilities and possible outcomes, it's the OECD. And you're part of the high-level risk forum. So were you guys a month ago sitting and going, okay, we've got to do recalibration on this, because it basically shocked the world to see a new crisis emerging in Eastern Europe?
Sure. I mean, I think at this point, you asked the question, what risks do we care about? At a certain point, we care about them all, right? They're all systemic risks. We have to stay connected to address the risks. And let's not lose a lot of sleep predicting what's going to happen. Let's just assume that our institutions, our populace, our economies are going to be under stress from a lot of different scenarios. And a lot of what we're trying to talk about at the high-level risk forum is what are the structures and methods to get cross-government, cross-society organizations working together to be a little more anticipatory, to put in place the structures, to make the investment that's necessary to be prepared, and to have the capacity to deal with the risks that are going to emerge.
So whether it's health, whether it's climate, whether it's geopolitical, we have to build resilience across that sphere.
The best way we address risk is by knowing us as organizations that be prepared to deal with things that happen, and to have the flexibility and innovation to innovate your way out of the particular mitigative solutions. And I think the structures that allow that to happen, and that does mean a lot of it not being a government by itself problem, right? It is a government and industry and non-governmental organization type structure. We have to unpack civil society, working with government, working with industry to innovate at speed, to address risk, and leave room for imagination.
Fantastic. Okay, so I want to take a look at the war, Russia, Ukraine, and what that means for Europe, what that means for security, and whether we were prepared to deal with this sort of crisis, which I think many people are pretty shocked by. Even if you spoke to Ukrainians a few months ago, they said, unlikely that this really is going to play out badly. We're all sitting in shock right now. And for Sweden, it's basically on your doorstep, not too far away. So is this what you've prioritized at this point?
This is the number one priority for us right now. And it's, I would say, just like you said, this is a systemic risk.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's a systemic risk is that it's actually a threat to the international security order that we have known since the Helsinki Final Act in '75, then the Paris Charter, then the United Nations framework, and small countries or medium, like Sweden and UAE for that matter, it's very, very much dependent on that we have rule-based systems and where we have a framework where we can have accountability, where we can analyze what's happening, and this is in the interest from all of us. And that's also why I'm very happy that there was such a huge number of states, 140, who's agreed in the United Nations to call it an aggression. But it's, these crises also highlight the true value of the frameworks we have to mitigate those risks. We have the European Union, we have the OSCE. I was myself personally and our country chairing OSCE last year, and we can see how those frameworks works to mitigate risk. This time it didn't help. I mean, we had a ministerial in Stockholm in December, that's just 4 months ago, where Russia started to say that we don't think anymore there is something like the European security order, and they wanted to go back to the sphere of interest of big power deciding what should other countries choose for their security. And that was something that we thought, wow, this is not something that is very good. But we did not think that they will go for a full-scale invasion to a sovereign country, unprovoked. Yeah. So it's not only a matter for the Ukrainians who are being bombed and are being, crushed. It's also a much wider risk for the whole security of Europe.
Absolutely, and also the contagion effect that's going to have on a global platform. Your Excellency, Foreign Affairs Minister, I think that emerging markets are often stuck in the middle of global crises that emerge. And we see the most vulnerable of communities being hard hit by decisions that are made at a global level within, sort of wealthier countries or the West. We just heard from Minister that it's really good that 141 countries condemned the aggression. Are you concerned that we don't have a multilateral approach to the crisis, and that could have a bigger effect on countries like Mexico?
Absolutely. I should say that in order to be safe or to reduce the risk, you need to strengthen global mechanisms. But the tendency, the path today is to a weakness in the global multilateral
and there are weaknesses that have emerged because we're seeing polarization.
It's going to be, we are going to see an increase in the weakness in the next months or years. But we need strengthen the multilateral organization in order to solve the risk, the main risk, which is...
Do you feel you have a voice as Mexico in this?
Well, we are in the Safety Council of the United Nations, and we presented those ideas almost every day in order to figure out how to deal with this. For instance, the other day we presented an initiative with France, was approved by a General Assembly for 140 votes in order to order a ceasefire and to start a humanitarian approach and to look for a political solution to the conflict. But you have in the Safety Council of the United Nations the principle that only the permanent members can veto any decision, which doesn't make sense. So we need to change this. We need to change the nature of our global governance in order to deal with the risk. Other way, we are going to have more and more risks because we don't have the capacity to find out the solution to those kinds of risks. Security or another pandemic or other issues.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Bob, I want you to jump in here. And I think, I was talking to the IMF MD at the Doha Forum over the weekend. And one of the things that came up is sort of a reorganization, calibration of the economic world order and what that would mean. Are you putting in your probabilities and scenarios that we're going to see the road of deglobalization, of perhaps global south and east teaming up together, of a complete rejigging of what we know today?
I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep over deglobalization as a concept. I think we are too integrated, too reliant, and I would say we are powerful for our global relations, being said, and I would hate to see a retraction from globalization.
But don't you think countries are starting to look inwards, perhaps, and say,
that being said, right, the multipolar global structure as opposed to a unipolar global structure, whatever words you want to use, I think is a real thing that's on the table. I think one of the things that U.S. is struggling with, and I think other countries are, in terms of looking inward, we're stronger if we don't just look inward. We have to invest in like-minded countries and like-minded societies and liberal market-driven democracy. There was a debate earlier this morning, but between democracy and autocracy. I think nations that are willing to invest in progress and liberalism should be allies in this, and we have to convince our citizens that that's the value system that we should be pursuing, because I think we are too far down the path of technological innovation, technological integration. Businesses are multinational, that it's impossible to unpack globalization. It's just got to be a smarter globalization, and we have to be prepared to win the battle of values.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about the votes at the UN Security Council. When you see countries abstaining from votes, Bob, does that concern you in terms of alliances, economic alliances that might emerge, and what should we be reading into that could create new risks because of what we're seeing with Russia?
I think the concepts that we were talking about earlier, the previous panel, of sort of scenario planning and planning this out and trying to shape international relations, diplomatic relations with the goal of a community of like-minded countries who share our values has to be a key element of that. Get into the room where diplomacy gets done. My colleagues certainly are in those rooms more frequently than that. But if we can align toward a shared objective of the great majority of countries, I think we can, and we should embrace the battle of ideas.
Mr. Linde, if I could get a sense from you about the energy security issue that's facing Europe right now. And there's this huge dilemma, right? You've got the countries that do have extra capacity saying, we're not ready to produce more oil. There's a lot of politics around those decisions, but also oil prices have been very volatile, moving $40 per barrel at a time, which means that there's speculation in the markets. Do you feel the international community generally have done enough to mitigate the risks, the global risks?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
And I can tell you also that when we had a meeting with the foreign minister in the European Union, we inviting the head of the International Energy Agency, and he told us some very hard facts about how dependent Europe, EU, is of Russian fossil fuels.
Yeah.
For example, 40% of the natural gas come from Russia that we are using in the European Union. Sweden, we don't use any fossil fuel more or less anymore, but many countries are depending on it. And we are committed both to reach the Paris Climate Agreement and to take away the vulnerability that depending on Russian fossil fuel is showing. And here the connection between climate and security is so visible. And I also think that it's you can see the change in Germany, for example. They had nearly finished the Nord Stream 2. Anyway, they took the very, very painful decision to stop it. And also, you can see it in several countries. When I presented the yearly Foreign Affairs Declaration for the Swedish Parliament, I announced that we will now have a special envoy for climate and security because this is so connected and it's a threat to us.
Okay, so are you worried that climate issues and the climate agenda is not going to receive the focus it needs because of geopolitics?
That is a risk, but now when we see how interconnected it is, I think that people, it's an eye-opener.
Yeah.
That you see that we being dependent on Russian fossil fuels make us vulnerable when we want to, for example, apply sanctions, to stop the behavior of Russia towards Ukraine. And I think that in this way, many governments who thought that this was not a problem have been clear that this is a problem.
Minister Ebrard, you're talking about vaccines. You were talking about just how emerging markets in general have been very hard hit by the pandemic. And I think emerging markets had a bigger dilemma than the richer countries. And there was actually major, a huge divergence in terms of what we saw, the fiscal capabilities of the richer nations to be able to stimulate the way out of the pandemic and the crisis. And emerging markets and poorer countries were left behind. Do you think that that in itself has created polarization when we start to see new global risks emerging, where we actually need multilateralism, but emerging markets are going, well, hang on, we weren't treated fairly when we had a really big crisis, and it was unprecedented, and we didn't receive the assistance we should have?
Absolutely. I think that, let me say that there are competition and a possibility or a contradiction between a global response. You need a global response in order to be safe yourself.
Yeah.
In the case of pandemic.
Yeah.
But you have the political pressure in your country to say, don't leave the vaccines until we finished. So how to deal with this? We proposed, and finally did in Latin America, an agreement with AstraZeneca, Oxford, and then other enterprises in order to increase the production in the short term. Okay, we did it. Mexico, Argentina, and other countries. Yeah. It took something like 7 months. It was our initiative. It wasn't planned. It was the middle-income countries organized Latin American and Caribbean countries. Now, tomorrow I am going to be in India in order to have an agreement and to not forget the lesson of this pandemic, in order to increase our capacities, reduce the vulnerability in terms of those kind of contradiction in the rich countries. Yeah. Because they show us that they are going to choose the first path instead of the second. So what can be our choice? To increase our capacities and our own production in terms of vaccines for the next one.
Do you also feel alone when a crisis hits as middle-income countries, where middle-income countries need to naturally start looking inwards to find solutions and not rely on this sort of notion of multilateral, global collective spirit working together to find solutions?
No, we are proposing a reform in several instruments, multilateral instruments, in order to reduce this in the next pandemic. So maybe we can have, and I'm sure that can be done, we can have a new shareholders with the global institutions in order to avoid the nationalistic decisions style that we lived just past year. Yeah. In order to confront the next pandemic that we are going to have, certainly.
Or the next risk that
absolutely.
might emerge.
Yeah, okay. It's possible. Let's be.
Let's hope.
Let's see.
Let's see. Let's hope that we,
this is the only hope that we have.
I mean, as the minister says, the new normal is risk after risk after risk. Bob, if I could just put it simply and just whittle it down to the simplest form, is there appetite for multilateralism and true collective spirit right now in dealing with any and every risk, from health to nuclear?
There's appetite in this fora, right?
Yes.
There's appetite in a lot of fora here. I think one of the dilemmas of risk after risk after risk is it keeps us away from the moments to do planning and to build the right structures and make the investment not in the middle of crisis. There's the saying in the U.S., a crisis is a horrible thing to waste. Let's not waste the crisis in terms of the lessons we've learned, that we need to be closer together to work through these shared objectives. But let's hope that we get to a period where it isn't risk after risk, where we can do a little more smart planning and capture some of these lessons and design them into our system.
Isn't our hyperconnectivity created risks in itself? And we've seen this emerge due to the pandemic.
But
when one port closes down, we've got a deficit of a supply in another country.
It does, but it creates opportunity for resilience, right?
Okay.
And so the trick, just like technology creates risk, but creates new opportunity. And the trick for all of us is to have the opportunity beat the risk.
Okay, so we're going to start wrapping up because we're running out of time. But Minister, I want to get a sense from you how you and your people are feeling. Sweden isn't part of NATO, but you have treaties in place. And you know that, and I know that you're hoping that should something happen, you will get the assistance that you need. Are you worried that needs to be activated in the next few months? How are you feeling?
Well, what we are doing now is that we are having discussions with all 8 parliamentary parties to have a deliberation on what does this major crisis mean for our security. And we have already since the annexation of Crimea, which was also a breach of international law, we have risen our defense spending with 85%. And now we have taken decision to go up to 2% of the BNI with our defense spending.
Did you have to take money away from another project or department or agenda in order to increase spending?
Of course, this is a discussion in the parliament.
Yes.
But we are now assessing what it would mean. And I don't think that Putin was expecting everything that is now happening when it comes to deepening the relation with NATO for all countries, putting the transatlantic link closer together, and being so united when it comes to sanctions, for example. So this is consequences of this flagrant violation of international law.
Minister Ebrard, when you're thinking about future risks in the next year, what would you say is top of mind for you right this minute, and how are you planning to become even more agile than what we thought we could become since the pandemic?
Sure. I think that the worst scenario is to have a division in the multilateral order in order to have both 2 superpowers competing in different, like in the Cold War with other possibilities and reasons, and we in the middle. So we are going.
You have to pledge allegiance at some point.
Yeah, we need to work together with other countries in order to avoid this risk, because this risk can duplicate your list of risks, because you need global responses, and you have a division in the multilateral order, and it's so extreme that you have a polarization that you cannot organize a global response.
Are you worried that this is a reality? Do you
yes.
think that will?
Yeah,
do you think it's inevitable, or do you think it's just a big probability?
It's a great probability. I mean, you have two trends: resignation, leave things go ahead, or try to work with numerous countries in order to limit this process that we are seeing already with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It's the main risk.
Bob, you're the data guy. You're looking at probabilities. You're measuring what people are thinking and saying at government level, and you're ascertaining just how effective that is. What are you thinking when you woke up and you saw that this is happening? The words of World War III are being uttered far too often for anyone's liking. Tell me about what you're thinking for the next few months or year.
I mean,
give me good news, please.
Getting out of bed energized to deal with it. I mean, the things to think about, we haven't talked about the immediate cyber risk, but we're in a higher period of cyber risk. Risks associated with escalation, and so we have to create a path to de-escalation. and then risks associated with shortages of commodities, whether it's energy or food or things that flow from that. Those are going to be realities, and that means preparing the populace to deal with periods that they're going to be negative impacts on people's lives, but those negative impacts are for the greater good. And I think the conversation between government about what's really going on in transparency so that people are prepared to deal with the consequences of addressing the horrible actions.
Yeah, because the sanctions have caused a major contagion effect globally. Some companies are self-sanctioning, right? They're viewing anything Russian, for example, toxic. It's creating havoc on the supply chains. Do we really know, can we really gauge the true impact of the sanctions on the global economy? Do we know? We're still working on those
We
figures.
still need to work. I mean, the good news is, going back to technology, there's data out there, there's models out there so that we can better anticipate potential shocks there, and we can monitor whether we're heading in that direction. And that's what countries should be doing right now, anticipating things that could go wrong and having contingency plans in place.
Well, I hope when we meet next, we will be talking about collective spirit globally, and that we won't have risk after risk after risk. Thank you very much, Your Excellencies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Great to see you. Thank you. Round of applause, please.